Good morning, friends. We have Entering the New Testament, Part 1, Session 2 today. The title, It's All About Hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the art and science of interpretation. Anything worth doing is both an art and science. That is, there are methods, procedures, you might say there's a math to things, and I'm referring now to hermeneutics, which is a discipline within the human sciences. It's not mathematical, of course, it's linguistic, but this does not mean that there aren't structures to language, discourse, and these kinds of things. When I say it's all about hermeneutics, what we want to do is we want to enter this today. I want to give you just kind of a little brief history of some things that have been important to me in hermeneutical discussions over the years and books I've read. And I want to in a sense, presuppose what I'm going to conclude, which is this. Revelation occurs both within and without our constructs. That is, the reality of all life is metaphorical. There's an is and an is notness to everything. This is the heart of symbolization. We'll talk about this a little later with Ricoeur, with the origin of language, Girard, Eric Gans, and others. The important thing here to recognize right off the bat is that here in the 21st century, what we are experiencing is the is-notness of language. Whereas modernity, in a sense, was looking for the isness of language. And you can take this back even further into the East and the West. So, for example, Karl Barth will chide the entire Western or Roman Catholic tradition, I should say, with use of what he calls the analogy of being, the analogia entis, and he calls that the invention of the Antichrist in his preface to the first edition of the Romans. So you have this God is like, and then you look around you, and you say, okay, God is like this, God is like that. You're looking for analogies, and so, of course, some of the early analogies that are used and badly used today, like the doctrine of the Trinity. God is like water. God can be steam. God can be liquid. God can be ice. These kinds of things. You're looking for analogies. This is the analogy of being, and Barth had a real issue with that because he realized that human reason could not look at the natural world and conclude the character of God. That's what he perceives to be Paul's argument in Romans 1:18 to 32. When it comes to natural theology. So we are left with this is-notness now in postmodernity, and we've deconstructed language so thoroughly, and we've done this thing where language is political, language is laden, theory laden, to use Michel Foucault's terms. All language contains within it all of these negative seeds. Language is patriarchal, language is hierarchical, language, and all of these things can and may be true and often are true. However, what's happened, and this is the result of Derrida and deconstruction and the loosing of truth of being from truth of statements, this disconnect that's happening, it's kind of an ignoring, in a sense, of Wittgenstein and Ricoeur and the work that they have done, and a turn toward what I want to call linguistic nihilism. That is, we've reached the end of the road where words mean anything. They don't mean anything anymore. They mean whatever we want them to mean. And so I can be talking, and you're not actually listening to me. You're just interpreting what I'm saying through your grid. You're not listening. And this is what we all do all the time. And this is going to be a major factor in hermeneutics. Learning the voices in our head, learning the grids, learning the systems, learning the theories that are here, that are non-conscious, making them conscious, realizing what they are, where they come from, and as much as is humanly possible. And that's one task of hermeneutics. And then the second task has to do with the text, listening to the text, letting the text be the text. So that's where we're going to go today. I want to start with Walter Wink. Walter, as you know, and June were friends of Lori and ours, and I learned a ton from Walter in his later years. It's a funny thing. I had read Walter's Bible and Human Transformation, of course, and the Powers series, and a few of his other works, and had a huge respect for Walter, but never had really known him as a person. And so we were grateful for that opportunity in the last few years of his life to get to know him as a person. But in 1972, he published the book, The Bible and Human Transformation. He was at Union Theological Seminary in New York City at the time. And of course, the faculty at that point is extremely liberal. And I needn't say much more, but Walter publishes his book, The Bible and Human Transformation. And I'm going to read how it opens. I want to read the epigraph that is a quote from Nietzsche. And then I'm going to read the first two paragraphs. And the reason I'm reading this is because a lot of you, and the reason I'm starting here is because a lot of you have come from evangelicalism, fundamentalism, charismania, and you've discovered what you all call deconstruction. That is, you've discovered the historical critical method. You discovered Marcus Borg and Bart Ehrman and N.T. Wright and these others, and they're engaging in this methodology, this historical critical methodology that for you blows away all the crap, fundamentalism, evangelicalism, etc. But now you're stuck in a million questions regarding history and faith and what counts as evidence and what doesn't, and why do scholars say this and some scholars say that, and who you're going to believe and who has more authority. And you're stuck here in critical distance, and we want to get you out of that. We want to move you forward. We want to move you to second naivete. We want to help bridge the gap. And so we're going to talk today about the two horizons. We're going to use a lot of Anthony Thistleton's work today in this talk. So here's Walter Wink's epigraph from Nietzsche in The Bible and Human Transformation, 1972. It is terrible to die of thirst in the ocean. Do you have to salt your truth so heavily that it does not quench thirst anymore? It's terrible to die of thirst in the ocean. Do you have to salt your truth so heavily that it does not quench your thirst anymore? That's Nietzsche. Here's Walter. Historical biblical criticism is bankrupt. There's the line that got him denied tenure at Union Seminary, and he would end up teaching at Auburn. Historical biblical criticism is bankrupt. This is 1972, people. I use bankrupt in the exact sense of the term. A business which goes bankrupt is not valueless nor incapable of producing useful products. It still has an inventory of expensive parts, a large capital outlay, a team of trained personnel, a certain reputation, and usually, until the day bankruptcy is declared, a facade which appeared to most to be relatively healthy. The one thing wrong, and the only thing, is that it is no longer able to accomplish its avowed purpose for existence, to make money. It is in this precise sense that one can speak of the historical critical method generally, and its application to biblical studies in particular, as bankrupt. Biblical criticism has produced an inventory of thousands of studies on every question which has seemed amenable to its methods, with a host of additional possibilities still before it. It has a method which has proven itself in earlier historical periods to be capable of remarkable achievements. It has in its employ hundreds of competent, trained technicians. Biblical criticism is not bankrupt because it has run out of things to say or new ground to explore. It is bankrupt solely because it is incapable of achieving what most of its practitioners considered its purpose to be. So, to interpret the scriptures that the past becomes alive and illumines our present with new possibilities for personal and social transformation. Walter's argument is that the historical critics have so parsed the text that it no longer speaks to us, that we dwell in our unresolved questions, satisfactorily dwell there, often miserably, wishing that we could find truth or that God would speak, but we remain, like most of the historical critics, satisfied with sucking on a cactus or two in the desert of criticism. And cacti will keep you alive in the desert. but it's not a lot of fun. Now, Anthony Thistleton, in his book, New Horizons in Hermeneutics, this is from page 589. I'll give you the text, I'll give you the page numbers in case you're interested in looking things up. Makes an argument that is strong for us. And I say this because one thing I've noticed about lay people is that the moment they leave this evangelical fundamentalist model, this be-all and end-all model, and they discover historical criticism, and this is also true of first-year seminary students coming out of Sunday school class into graduate education, is they assume, once they've kind of drunk from this well, that this well of historical criticism means that we have to be completely objective about everything and impartial about everything, and therefore we can never really know anything. And that's kind of where we're at today in this postmodern malaise. We can never really know anything. Now, I made the case at the end of last week, there's a fourfold knowing that we do when it comes to Jesus: reason, tradition, scripture, experience. I have to presuppose this in the context of the church. All talk about Jesus is ecclesial if it's authentic. The moment you drop the ecclesial element out of it, all you're going to end up with is historical speculation. And while that's good and it can be helpful and beneficial, it can only be a first step. We're going to be making that case using Karl Barth, and we're going to make that case using Thistleton and others. Here's what Anthony Thistleton says: but to say rightly that no one can fully reach the goal of impartiality, that is, here we are, we're moving forward, we recognize that language has all of these power structures in it, and that, you know, we're using language certain ways, and we'll never be impartial, we'll never be able to come to the text without presuppositions, we're always reading the text with these things. He says, so then the conclusion people draw is, okay, because of that, we really can't travel any further to knowledge. He says, but to say rightly that no one can fully reach the goal of impartiality does not logically entail the proposition that no one can begin to travel along the road to more critical openness. There you have it. I thought I came up with that phrase the other day, critical openness. I didn't. It was locked in my head from reading this text some 40 years ago, and then rereading it again last night, wanting to be able to use this particular book by Anthony Thistleton, New Horizons in Hermeneutics, and his other work that we'll be quoting in a minute, The Two Horizons. What good interpreters of Scripture recognize is that there are two parts to interpretation theory. It not only is an art and a science, it involves the text and the reader. The text and the reader together, or the text and the auditor, if you're hearing a text, okay, as they did really for the first several millennia. Jacques Ellul, I believe it's in his book, The Humiliation of the Word, I think it's there, speaks of the importance of hearing the biblical text, and that's why it becomes important when you're reading the Bible to read it out loud, inflect it, you know. And you'll see that the way you inflect things is also a reflection of you, and you may need to inflect them differently if the author's moving in a different direction. So here's what Thistleton has to say about these two horizons. He says, the goal of biblical hermeneutics is to bring about an active and meaningful engagement between the interpreter and the text in such a way that the interpreter's own horizon is reshaped and enlarged. I'm going to come back to another quote of his in a minute. This is what I said last week. When you engage the Bible, it's going to change you. One way or another, it's going to change you. If you're evil, it will make you more evil. If you're reading it with openness, it'll make you into Jesus. It does something. It's not a neutral text. You just can't enter this biblical text as though it's not neutral. It's powerful. It'd be like telling a shaman they could walk into a sacred grove and there's nothing there, and the shaman would look at you and they'd just nod their head and they'd go, okay, you first. The goal of biblical hermeneutics is to bring about an active and meaningful engagement between the interpreter and text in such a way that the interpreter's own horizon is reshaped and enlarged. In one sense, it is possible to speak with Gadamer of the goal of hermeneutics as a fusion of horizons. In practice, because the interpreter cannot leap out of the historical tradition to which he or she belongs, the two horizons can never become totally identical. Somebody needs to tell this to the charismatics. That's realized eschatology in a hermeneutical frame. At best, they remain separate but close. Nevertheless, the problem of historical distance and tradition should not give rise to undue pessimism. Somebody has got to tell this to the progressives in the academy. Even if the problem of hermeneutics are not trivial, neither are they insoluble. And there is always progress toward a fusion of horizons. The Bible can and does speak today in such a way as to correct, reshape, and enlarge the interpreter's own horizons. The argument here is very simple. If you're coming to the biblical text, as the text is inviting you to consider it, not how you think you ought to consider it, not what science is telling you to do when you consider it, not what the church is telling you to do when you consider. If you come to the Bible and consider it in the way that it frames itself, then you will hear God speak. The problem is, we come to this text, all of us, with these grids. We come into a church tradition, we get born again, we're raised in it, we get converted to it, we switch from one to the other, we learn these new paradigms and models and ways of thinking, and we get all excited. We don't realize that any one thing we begin to take apart in this model, atonement, views of scripture, eschatology, it really doctrines of election, Christology, it doesn't matter. Once we begin to take them apart, the whole thing unravels. And then we're stuck. And it's time to get out of that stuckness. So his Thistleton says on page 455 of The Two Horizons, the hermeneutical goal is that of steady progress toward a fusion of horizons. We are looking to actually know the voice of the Father in the text. And the Father can be heard through the Son by the Spirit. This is something, people, that I just cannot emphasize enough. And Karl Barth recognized this. This is one of the strengths of Barth's theology, is to tie the doctrine of revelation to the Trinity, not even to tie it, to acknowledge that the Trinity is the doctrine of revelation. Revelation is the doctrine of the Trinity. Revelation is the character of God. And that's the gospel. Revelation is God revealing God's self. And we, by the Spirit, hearing God's self authentically, not through these grids. The hermeneutical goal is that of a steady progress toward a fusion of horizons, but this is to be achieved in such a way that the particularity of each horizon, yours, mine, and the text's, is fully taken into account and respected. This means both respecting the rights of the text and allowing it to speak. The frame by which I think we have to come to the biblical text in the 21st century, and something that is important to begin with, is the way that Ulrich Lutz, the Matthean scholar, talks about the history of the effects of interpretation. That is, we are, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, we are aware that texts don't have meaning. Meaning is created using texts. And so in the last century, this has been the the blessing and bane of literary criticism is to kind of end up in this reader response approach to things, where you stand before a text as you would before a painting and ask the question, what does it mean to me? As though we are the be all and end all of meaning. And then once I discern what it means for me, I can't say anything more, because what it means for me is going to be different than what it means for you. There's no place for discourse when it comes to this approach. But there is an approach using the history of effects. You can see, for example, the effects of Calvinism on the West for good and for ill. Obviously, apartheid in South Africa is for ill. Neo-Calvinism in America and its vision of American history, Western history, human history, the extraordinary greed that's there, and how that infects the charismatic movement and creates this realized eschatology, is a huge bane. But that doesn't mean that Calvinism hasn't brought also its benefits in its wake, when things certainly of the Presbyterian Church USA, Princeton Seminary, many of the great Dutch Reformed thinkers, Barth, obviously, and others. So you look at the history of effects of interpretation, that is, why do we value, for example, the work of St. Francis? Because of the effects of his person and writings on our tradition. Why do we excoriate Adolf Hitler and Mein Kampf? Because of the effects on our history and our tradition. So, one of the reasons that Paul has been so excoriated, and frankly, largely because of misunderstanding, it starts with a very unhealthy understanding of Paul in the Protestant tradition, going all the way through the Lutheran reading into the 1960s, and the role that Paul had, or that reading of Paul had, in both the Holocaust, on women, the misogyny that was justified by an appeal to Paul. My gosh, the appeal in Romans 13 to empire, just this fantastic misreading of Paul that produces this reactionary response that assumes that reading is correct, and then turns around and creates an ulterior Paul the myth maker, Paul the bad guy, Paul the misogynist, Paul the evil, wicked one, Paul the inventor of Christianity, Paul the one that didn't know Jesus, yada, yada, yada. You have this distorted reading of Paul, and it too has had its effects on the history of interpretation. So much so that someone like Douglas Campbell's work is the necessary, absolutely essential corrective to this kind of thinking. Max Turner, in a festschrift of sorts for Thistleton called Spanning Two Horizons, in his essay on page 44, says, as I understand it, the primary task of theological hermeneutics in the public domain, and that's what we're engaging in, theological hermeneutics in the public domain, is an ethically responsible reading of the text for its most critically transparent sense and significance. I want to read that again. This is Max Turner. As I understand it, the primary task of theological hermeneutics in the public domain is an ethically responsible reading of the text for its most critically and transparent sense and significance. I want to parse this for a second. If the primary task of theological hermeneutics in the public domain is an ethically responsible reading of the text, then the real question arises is, whose ethics? I mean, one can come at the text from a conservative evangelical perspective and argue that its ethics are the most critically transparent sense and significance of the text. They're just reading the text literally. If the Bible condemns this or the Bible valorizes that, they're just reading it literally. So this is too vague for me. as a way of engaging theological hermeneutics in the public domain. But I want to come back to an ethically responsible reading of the text for its most critically transparent sense and significance. And this becomes really, really important, because the real question is the Bible transparent? Is the Bible clear? Is it clear? I mean, you start with Genesis, you read all the way through to the book of Revelation. Is it clear? Well, folks, it's clear as mud. You know this. It's like swimming in quicksand, 10 feet under. You don't know if you're up or down, or which way is up or down, or which way is sideways, or if you have hope of being saved, as you're swimming in this morass from Genesis to Revelation. Where do you begin? How do you come at this text? And if you're looking for an ethically responsible reading of texts, again, whose ethics? Is the Bible transparent in both its sense and its significance? I don't think that the Apostolic Church would say it was. I think what is transparent is the gospel. And the gospel is not the Bible. The gospel is a message found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul. The gospel is the story of Jesus of Nazareth. That is clear and transparent. But you can only make that case when you do it, as we'll start next week, from a theology of the cross, because the cross is what brings to transparency that which is hidden from the katabole kosmou, that is, the victim. So before we get there, we have to acknowledge that right now, at this particular point, those that have moved into critical distance are correct to look out and say, this text doesn't make much sense. It's convoluted, it's distorted, it goes this way, that way, up and down, it contradicts itself. There's just nothing here that allows one to talk about the biblical view of, or God speaking. Because the reading of text is not neutral. You can sit at in your faculty office, surrounded by your books, typing away on your computer, believing yourself to be a scholar, objective, and you're just reading things and analyzing things, and you're doing that kind of work. But in reality, you have an agenda. You're writing over against certain interpretations. All of us do this that write. No book is created in a vacuum. When you read and write texts, you are not neutral. You are both engaging and being engaged at the same time. Here's Thistleton again in New Horizons and Hermeneutics, page 31. He talks about transforming texts. Walter Wink sought that as well. But remember, Wink's argument about the historical critical method was that it didn't allow text to transform people. So here's Thistleton on transforming texts. The phrase transforming texts can be interpreted in two ways. Text can actively shape and transform the perceptions, understanding, and actions of readers and reading communities. This has been my argument all along, that this is precisely what happens when you engage the text. Turner recognized that in his notion that theological hermeneutics in the public domain has a task of an ethically responsible reading of the text. That is, he's saying there's a way to read the text that's better than others, especially when you look at the history of the effects of interpretation. Thistleton is affirming this, that texts actively shape and transform the perceptions, understanding, and actions of readers and of reading communities. Legal texts, medical texts, and biblical texts provide examples, but texts can also suffer transformation at the hands of readers and reading communities. Readers may misunderstand and thereby misuse them. They may blunt their edge and domesticate them, or they may consciously or unconsciously transform them into devices for maintaining and confirming prejudices or beliefs which are imposed on others in the name of the text. Readers and interpreters may also endow texts with new life in the context of new situations. Again, there's no such thing as coming to the Bible objectively. We all come with impartiality, but it doesn't mean we can't come with openness. I'm just trying to establish this right from the get-go. This is, for me, a delight. I want to introduce you to the importance of Karl Barth's 1917 Roma Brief. You'll see in the literature it's referred to as the 1918 version. It was actually published just prior to Christmas, 1917. The publisher wanted to get Christmas sales out of it. But most people don't note that because it became wildly popular in the beginning of the next year, in 1918, as the war was ending. Here's Karl Barth. He's writing this now in the 1950s, when he's in his 70s, and he's looking back on the years 1915, 16, and 17 as he was writing this absolute, as Karl Adam, the German theologian, put it, Swiss theologian, I think, he called this book a bombshell in the theologian's playground. You know, wham, just blew theology up, just totally reoriented, disoriented. Yeah, amazing book and an amazing time. But Barth in the 50s asks the readers of Edwin Hoskins' translation. He says, "I beg my English readers to remember that this book was written 11, or to be precise, 14 years ago." Oh, I'm sorry. So this would have been 1931 he's writing this. My bad. When I for some reason thought this was in the 50s. When I first wrote it, of the first edition, only the preface now remains. It has required only a little imagination for me to hear the sound of the guns booming away in the north. He was in a little parish in Sophenville, Switzerland at the time. The man who sat writing his commentary was then just a young country pastor, only vaguely aware of what responsibility in ecclesiastical and scientific matters really means. Altogether ignorant both of the forces which were ranged against him and of those upon which he might call for help, he tumbled himself into a conflict, the inward and outward significance of which he could not foresee. Now, here's the preface to the first edition to the Romans. For those of you that are interested in Barth studies, there's a wonderful book on Barth's draft prefaces, and I'm sorry I can't read the author's name right now off the book up there on my shelf. That's very important for establishing Barth's hermeneutical principles from reading the draft prefaces, the various draft prefaces to the Epistle to the Romans. But here's Karl Barth, 1917. Paul, as a child of his age, addressed his contemporaries. It is, however, far more important that as prophet and apostle of the kingdom of God, he veritably speaks to all men of every age. The differences between then and now, there and then, no doubt require careful investigation and consideration. But the purpose of such investigation can only be to demonstrate that these differences are, in fact, purely trivial. That's exactly what mimetic theory does, by the way. Here's Barth. The historical critical method of biblical investigation has its rightful place. Let me say that again. This is Barth. The historical critical method of biblical investigation has its rightful place. It is concerned with the preparation of the intelligence, and this can never be superfluous. But were I driven to choose between it and the venerable doctrine of inspiration, I should without hesitation adopt the latter, which has a broader, deeper, more important justification. The doctrine of inspiration is concerned with the labor of apprehending, without which no technical equipment, however complete, is of any use whatsoever. You see, already in 1917, Barth is talking exactly about what later writers like Thistleton and Gadamer will talk about, the fusion of these horizons. He goes on. Fortunately, I am not compelled to choose between the two, and neither was I, and neither are you. Nevertheless, my whole energy of interpreting has been expended in an endeavor to see through and beyond history into the spirit of the Bible, which is the eternal spirit. What was once of grave importance is so still. What is today of grave importance, and not merely crotchety and incidental, stands in direct connection with that ancient gravity. If we rightly understand ourselves, our problems are the problems of Paul. And if we be enlightened by the brightness of his answers, those answers must be ours. I don't know if you can begin to see here the connection of the way Doug Campbell approaches Paul, Barth's theology, Campbell's use of Barth, and how Campbell and Paul's view of Paul emerges out of that stream. It's all right there in the preface to the first edition to the Romans. Again, one of the beauties of Campbell's biblical studies is his theological grounding. And I'm going to come back again to the first talk I made, where I pointed out with Dietrich Rischel and Bernie Ram that anybody that teaches theology should spend 10 years teaching church history, 10 years teaching biblical studies, obverse order, biblical studies first, or New Testament, Old Testament, and then church history, and then they can teach theology. You see, it's all about hermeneutics. Babel, the problem of Babel is ancient and modern. All right? We're scattered today. We're scattered to the winds. If you want to perceive this postmodern situation as judgment, you may. It is. We've judged ourselves. We've said that this language thing is problematic. It was already recognized in the East, going back to Pseudo-Dionysius. I mean, the East has always known that language has limits. It was only because of the analogy of being in the West that we push those limits into metaphysics and beyond, and then from metaphysics back into doctrine, and by God, we've created a monster. No, like the ancients, we can recognize there's a limit to language, but we don't have to do what the nihilists do and say, therefore, language has no meaning. We can't get to the intention of the author. So I want to walk you through some great books that have been helpful to me over my journey. I'm going to begin, I'm doing these chronologically, not as I read them, but as they were published. The first is The Great Code by Northrop Frye. This book and Hans Frye's The Eclipse of Biblical Narrative, I remember reading at the same time, but Frye published this in 61, 62, I believe. I would have to look at the date. I'm sorry, this came out in 82. These aren't chronological. My bad. But I was reading this and a few other books on hermeneutics at this point, and this is already in 1982, will produce a mass reading in hermeneutics for me in and through my time at seminary. There was in the 70s the new hermeneutic. Oh, Lord have mercy, using the work of Gerhard Ebeling and Ernst Fuchs, Bultmann's students. This was edited by Robinson and Cobb, but I'm almost positive there's an essay in here by Bob Funk. Yeah, sure enough, The Hermeneutical Problem in Historical Criticism. Bob Funk would produce Language, Hermeneutic, and the Word of God. Bob Funk, you'll remember, is the fellow that started the Jesus Seminar. Funk grew up a fundamentalist, hated it, and spent his entire adult life trying to show that Christianity was fake, wasn't real. He just was trying to destroy the fundamentalism of his childhood years. Interesting thing about the Jesus Seminar and the Colloquium on Violence of Religion. Historical note here. The Westar Institute is Funk's institute there in California, and it's out of Westar that both the Jesus Seminar and the Colloquium on Violence and Religion will emerge at the same time, two separate streams. And there was a time when the Jesus seminar people invited Renee to come and speak to them, and let's just say it didn't go over so well. That's Bob Funk stuff. I mean, yeah. Gerhard Ebeling, Lutheran scholar Gerhard Ebeling. I bring up him because I have a number of his books. Word and Faith is a particularly important book to me. There's an essay in there on historical criticism that I think everybody needs to read. But Ebeling's work on a theological theory of language in the 60s and early 70s really was, from a German critical perspective, out in this kind of school of thinking, probably one of the finest pieces that was written. Of course, here in the States, you had Hirsch's Validity and Interpretation. This, I believe, is in the 67, arguing for the ability to perceive the author's intention, that you can say the author intended. This is what the author meant. I do find it fascinating. You have these great philosophers, and they're saying language has no meaning, language has no meaning, language has no meaning. They come home one day and they bring their significant other some flowers or some candy or something, and they say, "I love you," and their significant other just smacks them across the face, and they say, "What'd you do that for?" I said, "I love you. I brought you a gift." The person says, "I can interpret it any way I want. You went out and had an affair. I know you feel guilty." We don't work that way. They don't have relationships that way with their significant others. Language has meaning in real relationships, but they write all these books as though language has no meaning when it comes to things like theology and philosophy. It's patently absurd, frankly. What we're doing is we are navigating our ship between two dangers. And it is possible to navigate the ship between these two dangers if you're careful. The first is the Scylla of Fideism. Fideism is, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. End of story. The way I read the Bible is the correct way. I'm reading the Bible right, and you're reading it wrong. Boom, boom, boom. It's all black and white. And you have that not just in fundamentalism, evangelicalism, but progressive Christianity and liberalism as well, particularly in American Protestantism today, where ideological platforming is essential to identity. I tried to point out in my little paper on identity politics and the gospel that this kind of thinking comes straight out of Jerusalem Christianity, not gospel, but out of Jerusalem Christianity and its orientation to the legal sphere. It's stunning, the total inconsistency in the progressive left's view of things. They claim to be inclusionist, but they're quite exclusionist when it comes to white males. They claim to be for freedom, except for, certain speech. They've PC'd everything. They don't want these words said. I mean, the contradictions are eminently clear. They're truly not free. They're just another group creating scapegoats to build their little empire. This is the problem of all Protestantism. Protestantism is empire hell-bent, man, in every form. So we're going to navigate between the Scylla of Fideism, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, and the Charybdis of modernity and postmodernity, or the Enlightenment and postmodernity, however you want to phrase that. Really, as I tried to point out the other day, from the Renaissance forward, the last 900 years, we have the first 1,000 years, the church is fideistic, in a sense. The second 1,000 years, or the last at least, 700, 800 years, the church has begun to engage critical distance, human reason. Okay? Now we're at the place where both of these have crashed together. They're both there. They've been engaging, they've been mixing, they've been interacting for several hundred years now. And it has not been a pleasant engagement at all. And we see this being played out in the conflict between science and religion. We see this being played out in politics between liberal and conservative. We've seen it played out in the European wars of religious wars. We've seen it played out in apartheid and the Holocaust. I mean, we've seen it played out everywhere. Again, the history of the effects of interpretation. We're navigating between these, and it's possible to do so. You don't have to stay stuck in the desert of criticism. I remember Ricoeur in his great quote at the beginning of The Symbolism of Evil. beyond the desert of criticism we wish to be called. We are looking to engage head and heart, as it were, flesh and spirit together, as it were, the whole person, inner, outer, psychology, eco-spirituality, the whole person engaged, the whole person transformed, the whole person fused with the whole perspective of the horizon of the text, letting God indeed speak, letting ourselves indeed hear. The only way to achieve this is to change your epistemology. Your epistemology is how you know what you know. How do you know what you know? Now, I will tell you right off the bat that there's a fundamentally different epistemology in shamanism than there is in anything to do with the intellect. In the intellect, how you know what you know is all about methodology and scientific method and logic and these sorts of things. In shamanism, you don't know things on that level at all. Knowledge is different. It's fundamentally different. And his grandfather says, when you know that you know and you don't care how you know, then you've arrived. And that's how a shaman can know what's happening 10 miles away in the present, or what will happen tomorrow, or what happened in a particular spot 100 years ago. There's a knowledge that comes differently than through ratiocination, reasoning. I never tried to say that word before. That's a first. So we have to have an epistemology, and the real question is now, okay, where do we find this epistemology? Well, it's given to you straight up front in the Bible. This is the part of the Bible that's transparent. We're going to talk about this in our next session, when we discuss why begin with the cross. And we're going to observe immediately that there is in the cross both an episteme, that is a place, a starting point, that is the starting point for revelation, and I'm going to argue the starting point for science, the human sciences, that is. This is the burden of my PhD thesis, to argue that the cross of Christ functions as the fulcrum of all revelatory knowledge and the validity of human knowledge. Because only Jesus' death strips away the mythology in our human knowing, you see. But we'll get to that. The second thing the cross provides us is a hermeneutic. It is a hermeneutic of love. It is a way of interpreting reality from another perspective. And it's that interpretation of reality from this ulterior perspective of love, forgiveness, mercy, compassion, and peace that creates the possibility of an eschatology that brings exactly that, shalom. Don't be afraid, shalom. And the new reality that is just completely recreates the Apostle Paul, the writer of the fourth gospel, Luke, Acts, so many early Christians, so many Christians throughout the centuries, and so many today. The text transforms when we do all of our intellectual work, friends. And as Bart said, it's not superfluous. It's important as lay people that you're reading. It's important you're studying. It's important you're asking questions. It's important that you educate yourselves, or get an education, a good one, not a bad one, not a doctrinaire one, but a good one. It's important you do these things, because you have to do that. But it's then fundamentally even more important that when you come to the text, in a sense, you take all of this and you detach it slightly, just slightly, detach it, because it's not what you believe in. Your faith isn't in this. Your faith is in the living God, whom you're going to hear. But you're not going to do it apart from this. With me so far? Now watch this. When you come to engage the text, you're going to do the same thing that Carl Jung said, and when it came to the interpretation of dreams. And Jung was the master interpreter of dreams in the 20th century, much better than Freud. And Jung said, before you learn about the interpretation of dreams, learn everything you can about symbols, mythology, stories, anything to relate to the interpretation of dreams. But when you go to interpret a dream, forget everything you've learned. That's key, because you don't want to come to the dream and force your grid on it. That happened in psychotherapy for friggin' generations. No, let the dream give you the categories by which it's being to be interpreted, and let the dreamer, in a sense, provide the categories by which it's interpreted before you start forcing archetypes and this and that and the other on it. We want to do the same thing with the Bible. We want to allow the Bible to give us the categories by which it's to be read. And we can do that by looking at the way Jesus and the Apostolic Church read their Bible. That is, we can look at their hermeneutic engagement, and if we do it honestly, we're going to find that reading the Bible through the lens of the cruciform is the only perspective that brings revelation. And so again, as I said in the 14 lessons, which are in the files section, you can go read, what you have is a doctrine of the Trinity perceived and conceived in and through a theology of the cross, which provides the new epistemology, hermeneutic, and the resurrection provides the semiotics, the new semiotics, by which to hear the voice of God. You don't have to get locked into all of the nonsense of the historical critical method. You don't have to sit there and go, oh my God, is this an authentic saying of Jesus or not? Does it matter? Well, it can, or it doesn't have to. Because the thing we're looking for when we interpret texts, and the only question we're really going to ask, will be revealed next week. There's only one question you need to ask when you come to any text or anything. Maybe it's a manuscript correction. You're going to ask the same question of that. Maybe it's a commentary by a patristic father on a text. You're going to ask the same question as you would of the text itself. Maybe it's a commentary on a later father, like on Lombard sentences by Luther, or perhaps it's historical critical commentary, or perhaps it's poetry, or a song. You're going to ask the same question, one question. And at that particular point, you'll have the answers. And we're going to start next week, and we're going to look at that. See you soon.